McCohen and Hwan-Hee Lee, who I will introduce very shortly. But before we dive in, just a few housekeeping matters. We would kindly ask that all participants attending virtually to please add your name and your organization or your firm institution name to your Zoom name so we can all get to know each other a little better today. Please also feel free to introduce yourself in more detail in the chat and share with us perhaps what you're hoping to get out of today's session. For those of you who require interpretation, please select your preferred language channel at the bottom of your screens, sort of by the more options. And we would encourage you all to keep your cameras on during today's session, but please microphones off when not speaking or asking questions. But of course, throughout the session, we do strongly encourage participation and discussion. So without further ado, I'd like to start by introducing our three speakers today. So today we have with us Julia Mayer Hoffer from Pelnet. Julia is currently the interim co-executive director and director of Pelnet's Asia office. She joined the team in July 2018, and she oversees all operations and programs of Pelnet in Asia, which includes coordination of the Global Refugee Forum Legal Community Joint Pledge, which I will talk about in a little bit. Previously, she was also with the Asia Pacific Refugee Rights Network, or APRIN, for about 7 years, and she worked with a refugee community center in Hong Kong prior to that as well. Today, we also have Marianne McCohen. Marianne is a regional director for Europe with KIND, or Kids in Need of Defense. She manages KIND's portfolio of projects all across Europe that provides free legal assistance to unaccompanied and separated children in migration. And last but not least, we have Hwan-Hee Lee. Hwan-Hee is an attorney at law at Dongcheon Foundation, which is a public interest law foundation in Korea. Right after college, she joined Ernst & Young, a global business consulting firm, where she worked as a senior consultant for 5 years before starting law school. And with a focus on legal advocacy and policy reform for refugees and migrants, her current duties are representing refugees in litigation, as well as in RSD procedures. And the organizations and the panelists that are represented here today are all signatories to the Global Refugee Forum Legal Community Pledge. And for those of you who may not be familiar with the Legal Community Pledge, this pledge was made as part of the inaugural Global Refugee Forum in 2019 and was made by more than 80 law firms, bar associations, legal and community empowerment organizations that all came together to collectively pledge to address the diverse and unmet legal needs of refugees and others forcibly displaced around the world. Members of the Legal Community Pledge have expressly committed to supporting efforts to protect and find solutions and improve access to justice for refugees and others forcibly displaced, including through, but not only through, the commitment of pro bono hours and other resources. And since its formation, members of the Legal Community Pledge mobilize themselves in numerous ways in order to further their pledge commitments. So for instance, through the pledge, we have launched a matching portal to match the unmet legal needs with pro bono resources and help form new pro bono partnerships. Pledgers have also hosted an urgent consultation following the response to respond to the situation in Afghanistan. And as we'll get to today, in order to facilitate knowledge sharing amongst members of the legal community, there's also been a global mapping of good practices of different refugee rights pro bono projects from around the world. And so today's session is going to be structured as kind of a roundtable discussion where our speakers are going to share some of these lessons learned from these global good practice mappings that I just mentioned. And these mappings were conducted on how to kind of structure, develop, and most importantly, sustain refugee pro bono projects. And so today's session will kind of revolve around 3 rounds of questions. So the first round will be about the different types of pro bono models or projects that have been mapped and how those projects first got started by each of the speakers. Round 2 will be about sort of best practices and key takeaways that have come to light as these pro bono models have been actually operationalized. And round 3 will be a discussion about challenges and how these challenges have been overcome in the course of trying to sustain these refugee rights pro bono projects. I will leave time between each round for the audience to share any thoughts, reflections, or questions. And there will also be time at the end for about 15 minutes for sort of final discussions and a bigger Q&A. However, we do envision this session to be more of an open dialogue between the speakers and the participants, rather than a panel presentation. So please don't be shy to share your comments in the chat or raise your Zoom hand if there's something you want to add to the conversation throughout today's session. So maybe now to kick things off, I'd actually like to start by asking a question to our audience here today, just to get a little sense of who's in the room and kind of where we are. So please either raise your Zoom hand or give a Zoom thumbs up if you're from an organization or law firm that is already engaged in refugee rights pro bono projects or refugee rights pro bono work. And I'll raise my hand because Justice Center is. Okay. So we have a few hands raised, which is great. I hope that those of you who have raised your hand, besides speakers, will be open to sharing your own experiences with the wider group. So please don't be shy. But for now, let's turn it over to our panelists, perhaps for the first round of questions. And so as I mentioned, the first round of questions is a way to sort of understand the different types of refugee rights pro bono models that might exist. And so now turning to our panelists and maybe starting with Marianne, the first question to all the panelists is what kind of successful pro bono partnership models have you been involved with through your organization? And as part of those projects, what steps did you take to go about setting those partnerships or those projects up? And what were some of the first steps that you needed to take to get those off of the ground? So starting with maybe Marianne from Kind.
Thank you, Caroline. And just to say, I'm really delighted to join you all. I'm in Ireland, so I'm quite far away from you all at the minute, but I'm really delighted to join the session today. So I work with KIND, which is Kids in Need of Defence, and our mission is to provide free, quality legal assistance to unaccompanied migrant children on the move. We do run programs in the US, Mexico, Central America, UK, and in 4 countries in Europe. And working with pro bono lawyers is really a cornerstone of our work. We have expert asylum migration lawyers on staff who then train and mentor pro bono lawyers to provide legal assistance directly to unaccompanied children. So it's very much a partnership between lawyers, expert lawyers, and pro bono lawyers. And so globally, to date, we've assisted over 27,000 children, trained over 50,000 pro bono lawyers, and currently partner with over 700 law firms, companies, law schools, and bar associations. And, you know, in terms of our pro bono work, when we are setting up new projects, I've a lot to say about this work, because I think the setup of this work has such a significant influence over the success of the project overall. It's really worth putting a lot of time and effort, as much as you possibly can at the outset, to get the foundations of a pro bono project of this kind right. You know, we're working with vulnerable clients, and so it really is important to get those foundations right, because, you know, trial and error isn't really possible when you're dealing with people's lives. And so the first thing that we would typically do is we would map the need, as you would expect. So talk to lots of people, you know, read lots of reports, look at what the most pressing issues are for us that's facing unaccompanied minors. But we're also looking for issues that are not covered by state-provided legal aid, because we don't want to take over the role of the state, and we want to look for the gaps. And then we're also looking at what is the pro bono culture in that country, because if you're starting from scratch, if there isn't much of a pro bono culture, the lift is, of course, much heavier, because you have to build that up than if you are starting a project in a country where there already is an awareness of what pro bono is. There's some law firms doing it. So that's just something that we look at. And then we consider what issues are suitable for this kind of work, because not everything is. You know, we look for areas of casework that are perhaps relatively straightforward. They might be more administrative processes, like, applying for asylum or for family reunification, rather than like complex litigation. This is just specifically for our work, and I think that you'll hear about different models today. But what we do is we kind of keep the more complex casework for the expert lawyers that work on our staff. And then we assign the kind of the more straightforward day-to-day casework out to our pro bono lawyers. And so after we've done the mapping, the next thing that we do is look for the right partner. And we decide, if Kind is going to directly do the work ourselves, but what we've done in Europe so far is actually partner with local NGOs to deliver the project. This is because we were new to Europe when we started work in 2019. We didn't have the relationships with the refugee community in Europe. We didn't have the expertise in local laws of every country, but local NGOs did. And so we decided to use that kind of partnership model to combine the expertise that we had in setting up pro bono projects with the local expertise of the NGOs. And in deciding who to partner with, we looked at, of course, reputable organizations, organizations with a really long history of doing really great work with refugee communities, but also those that are open to the idea of working with pro bono lawyers, because not every organization is. So we're looking for, for lawyers, for individuals, but those organizations that are ready to try what can be something quite new and novel, that are willing to test this with us. And so then when we have that partner, we co-design what the model is going to look like, because there's lots of different ways that this can work. We look at how cases are going to be owned, who is the official representative of the client? Is it going to be the pro bono lawyers, or is it going to be the NGO? How are the lawyers going to be trained? How are you going to assign cases? How are you going to do supervision and ensure quality control of the cases? We think about all of these things up front, and kind of try to build a model that is adaptable as we go, but really just trying to think about all of the different processes that are going to be in part of the project in advance. And then, of course, another really key part of the setup is building the relationships with law firms and potential pro bono partners. What we found, at least in the jurisdictions where we work, is that it tends to be easiest to start with international firms, just because they typically have a pro bono program internally, maybe a pro bono manager, and resources really to support their lawyers to engage in pro bono. And then the final point that I'll make before I'll hand back to Caroline is just we tend to build in at the outset a period of like testing, reflecting, and adapting. It can be like up to the first year where we really just are explicit about the fact that we're testing what works and what doesn't. We're ironing out the kinks as they go. And so it's really important to kind of monitor and evaluate progress at the outset and throughout the whole project, but particularly at the outset, just to be intentional about watching for where there are problems in the system and being able to adapt to them as quickly as possible. So those are the things that just at the very outset that we would really put a lot of time and energy into getting it right before we start to launch into the work. So I'll just hand back to Caroline.
Thanks, Marianne, for that helpful sort of overview from Kind's perspective, and kind of reminding us that the beginning is definitely an important part of scoping and properly identifying needs, but the beginning process can take time. The beginning process, because it's so important and because of the clients that we're working with, needs to be done properly. And so it's a helpful reminder that beginning process can take a lot of time in terms of getting it right. I also kind of like what you said, and sort of saying that mapping is key to identify the problems, the gaps, and the capacities to see what can be done. But at the same time, it's also about recognizing that you don't necessarily have to do it all, and identifying more maybe simpler tasks or smaller projects that can be done and matching those with the right partner depending on who you're working with. So that was really great. So maybe next I'll turn it over to Huan He to maybe share your experiences in terms of the types of models that you've been working with at Dongchuan Foundation, and what were some of the crucial first steps that you had to take in terms of scoping your projects and things like that. So Huan He, I think Huan He also has some slides for us, so I'll give her a second to also share her slides.
Yeah, I have a presentation materials, so just let me share the slide with you. Yeah. So yeah, thanks to Caroline for introduction, and thanks for Marilyn for sharing her experience. So for my affiliation, Dongchuan Foundation, maybe pretty much any of you know this foundation. So I'm to just shortly tell you about my affiliation first. The Dongchuan Foundation is a group of lawyers who focus on the pro bono activities, such as usually it's litigations for people who we are helping with. It's I personally work with refugees and migrants mostly, but we also help other people such as the handicapped and the North Korean settlers and the youth and the women and the poor and so on. And we also do public interest law activities such as the legal system improvement and also the awareness campaign too. So for my slide, I'm going to tell you about the outline of our partnership model. And then I am going to also talk about the setting the model and what are the first steps in the current picture. So for our model, so for this question, the main model that I'd like to introduce you is the collaboration of a law firm public interest network and a refugee rights organization named Nansen. In Korean, refugee is Nanmin, and this center's name in Korean is Nanmin Inkwon Center. So we call it Nansen for short. So what is the law firm public interest network? It's simply a group of law firms, and it's pro bono focused entities if law firm has, because some law firms have them and some don't. So I'm going to talk about it a little bit more later at my next slide. So from here, you can see that this network is established in 2016 with 11 members of law firms, and now it has 12 members. So there was a demand from civil society for law firms to fulfill its social responsibilities, and also for law firms themselves, the importance of CSR, which is, as you already know, the corporate social responsibility activities has grown from mid 200s. So the members are the Kim and Lee, which is BKL in short, and a Dongchuan Foundation, which I belong to, and there are other firms. So for the so actually BKM made the Dongchuan Foundation, but I'm gonna talk later at my next slide about this relationship. So actually 10 of the members of this network signed the MOU memorandum with this refugee rights organization, as I tell you, the Nansen. So there is so we formed sort of like a legal support team to take cases which is referred by Nansen. So we have like regular meetings to discuss and be introduced by Nansen what kind of cases that are in our hand. And so a firm or a group of lawyers from different firms take the cases that they like to carry on. And we also have a forum to discuss experiences so that we share the results and what we have learned from each case and things like that. So it's like a roundtable of reviewing what we've done as well as what we could do better next time in helping refugees. So this is a picture of the last forum that we had in last spring. So basically, we provide a legal assistance and also the financial aid because these kind of NGOs in helping refugees, they also have a struggle with financial issues too. So yeah, to setting the model, I'd also, as I mentioned at the previous slide, there was an emergency of law firm pro bono activities in Korea. So as you can see from the first bullet, initial pro bono activities of the attorneys were not systemically coordinated. So LSR, which is law firm's social responsibility activities, focused more on the donations and volunteer work at first. And as just to let you know, the Republic of Korea is the first Asian country to enact the Standalone Refugee Act in 2013. So we have a RSD process, which is a refugee status determination process stipulated in law. But even though we have this kind of process and system in the law, there has been a very low rates of refugee recognition. So it means that there are many refugees and refugee applicants need a professional legal assistance in order to successfully advance their claims in this process and the following lawsuit if they got non-recognition decision from the government. And on the other hand, I already mentioned a little bit, but refugee rights organizations in Korea are very few in numbers and financially struggling. So they have more cases than they can handle, lacking the resources. So we kind of thought that there was a need to help those NGOs to more effectively help refugees too. So as I said at the previous slide, BKL established a pro bono committee within the firm in 2002. And then later they founded a Dongcheon Foundation, which is my affiliation. It's a public interest law foundation in 2009. So after establishment of Dongcheon Foundation, other major law firms followed suit. So most of the members of the law firm public interest network now has one or more full-time public interest lawyers, and majority of them have established a separate pro bono entity like Dongcheon Foundation. So to the previous slide, so BKL made a Dongcheon Foundation, and also Jipyeong, which is one of the big law firms in Korea, also founded Duru, which focuses on only the pro bono cases. So yeah, there are several cases like that in Korea, especially for big law firms. So and we also have in refugee rights protection, particularly, we also have a looser coalition of network, which named is Refugee Rights Network. And so for this network and this organization are all members of this Refugee Rights Network, so we can kind of work together and help the refugees more effectively in Korea. So I think those are the pretty much of me to discuss with you for the first question. And I'm gonna maybe hand it to Caroline again.
Perfect. Thanks, Won-hee. And I find it very interesting. Maybe I actually have a question. So you kind of mentioned that the impetus to sort of establish the group of law firms, the Law Firm Public Interest Network, was because there was demand from civil society for law firms to kind of do more public interest work. Can you explain a little bit about that in terms of, what was it? Was there like a particular event or one particular issue that kind of encourage law firms to kind of take the mantle and sort of initiate these foundations and things like that?
Yeah. So it's kind of unique model in Korea to for big firms focus on those pro bono acts, because I was told, maybe for example from the United States, mostly the government coordinates this pro bono work, like appointing and allocating the pro bono focus lawyers to each district throughout the country. But in Korea, as you mentioned, there was a demand from civil society, but not just because of just a particular event, but it's because from mid 200s, the law firms in Korea really has grown. It's in their profit making and in their presence in this legal market. But but maybe people think that for that area and for that period of time, people think that companies and corporates, big corporates like maybe Samsung, they need to have more contribution to the society and contribution to the civil society, and that's also the same level for the same voice applies to the law firms too. So if you guys make a lot of profit from this market and from the customers in Korea, you need to have more responsibility for the civil society and the people who are probably marginalized from the society and the minorities that you need to concern more. So I think that's kind of the background of this movement.
Yeah, it's very interesting because it kind of ties a little bit to what Marianne was saying about how building pro bono projects also kind of depends on what culture already exists or what culture needs to be built in order for pro bono to kind of take form. So I think that's an interesting sort of tie into what Marianne had to say. So maybe now we'll turn it over to Juglia to maybe also address this first question about types of pro bono partnership models that Pelnet has engaged with, and what are some of the key sort of first steps that Pelnet takes in setting up pro bono partnerships.
Yeah, thanks, Caroline, and thanks everyone for joining us today. I hope I'm sure we're going to have a very interesting conversation. I thought I'll maybe introduce Pelnet quickly because our experience is quite a different one. And first of all, just to say as a full disclaimer, we are not like the traditional refugee legal aid provider, but as Caroline has already introduced in the beginning, we basically coordinate the Global Refugee Forum pledge. Our work as Pelnet as an organization itself is not exclusively focused on refugees and forced displacement. We work actually across many different issues, but access to justice for refugees and people on the move has somewhat also become a priority area for us as well. And Pelnet itself as an organization has been involved in developing pro bono partnerships globally for many years. So we have been around actually for a very long time. We're celebrating our 25th birthday this year, our anniversary. So there's a lot of knowledge that exists within the organization as well that goes beyond refugee rights, but is I think still applicable to this conversation as well. And I think a lot of the things that we will discuss today are not only things that are specific to refugee rights pro bono projects, but could also be applicable for those of you that maybe work with other vulnerable groups as well. I will mostly speak from the perspective of a good practice mapping exercise that we have started to look at back two years ago, essentially. And this was basically part of this idea of how we want to operationalize the pledge, the Global Refugee Forum pledge that Caroline has talked about in the beginning. And what we did as part of that, and really one of the first things that we did was really a legal needs assessment and a mapping exercise. It was not like an in-depth one, looking at every country in the world. It was somewhat a more overarching effort, but we did really look at conducting this initial mapping exercise and then really looking at just broadly, what are the legal needs of refugees and others that have been forcibly displaced, and to also really understand what is the existing work that is already taking place by NGO, law firms, and others working in this field. And what we really saw through this assessment that actually there's a lot of work already done, and there's actually a lot of good practices out there already in terms of, how one can develop, structure, and then also sustain and maintain some of these projects. And yeah, you have some of the examples here today as well. And what we then did afterwards, we basically decided that we thought it would be worthwhile to study some of those examples in a bit more in depth. So we embarked on this, what we call good practice mapping exercise. Since then, is a bit of an ongoing process. I think in total, we have looked at over 10 different models so far, not only in Asia, actually, but then also outside of as well, US, Europe. We also saw some interesting practices in Australia as well. And we really thought it is a useful exercise to really look, what kind of works well, what are some lessons learned, and how can we also then consider this information to be shared externally. So it's almost like, developing a little bit of a community of practice or so, if you want to call it like that. And actually, we're also hoping to summarize some of those findings in a guide that hopefully we can make available to everyone later on as well. So I think the discussions today would probably also be part of this as well. And then in addition to this good practice mapping exercise, I will just add one more thing as well. Pelnet has also been very closely involved in setting up a pilot project actually in Thailand, which again is also part of the pledge. But there we have really started from scratch. And this particular project looks also at setting up refugee rights pro bono model, which looks at addressing some of the unmet legal needs of refugees and others who are forcibly displaced in Thailand. So and maybe I'll come back to it later as well. But just overall, also going back to the question that you asked, Caroline, about first steps and how one goes about setting up some of those partnerships. I think through the mapping, there's a few key things that we have seen come out very strongly, and that have come up in several of the projects that we have also looked at. One is scoping and understanding the needs. So Marianne has already talked about that in detail, right? But that was probably one of the things that came out very strongly in the good practice mapping that we have also done as a key factor that seems to be really determining how successful projects can be in the long term. So really understanding what the needs are in the first place has been, I think, one of the key things that we have seen. And actually, in many cases, the scoping and the mapping part can take a really long time. I'm sure Marianne can maybe also speak to that as well, but we have seen that actually if the scoping and the mapping and understanding the needs part is really done properly and well, then actually it can take some time. But again, I really think is an important piece to lay the groundwork for a successful projects in the future. And even in our example in Thailand, actually, we pretty much took a whole year actually to map and understand the needs. And then we moved from mapping to consulting key stakeholders. So we actually gave our NGO partners the opportunity to come together, and we held workshops where we actually looked at how we can co-design this project together and basically design a model together that works for everyone. And yes, I mean, I don't have to tell you that it's always easier to do things by yourself, right? But we actually found through the process that it's been a really valuable exercise. And although it took longer, I think the project will probably be more sustainable in the long run. Then I think another thing, maybe I'll just also quickly talk about it, and Marianne has also mentioned that as well, and this is another thing also that came up in the good practice mapping exercise. The pro bono projects that we have mapped, they're not looking at addressing all the legal needs of all refugees, right? They really often look at very particular pieces and particular areas as well. And I think it's really important on both sides to look at what you can practically refer to pro bono lawyers and what perhaps is suitable to do and what is not. And that can also take some time and may require some internal conversation, some conversation with law firm partners as well. Pelnet has developed together with our other core group members what we call like a menu for pro bono services. I'll share it in the chat afterwards, but it's generally like a really helpful overview of possible areas where law firms can provide assistance in. Because sometimes we also found that NGOs, when they newly embark on this, maybe they're also not quite clear how law firms can support them with. And there's more also than just direct representation. And there's many, many different ways law firms can support NGOs. So we have also tried to look at this piece of mapping as well and try to understand a bit, what are some of the different areas. And Caroline has just shared the link. So I think you can have a look at that as well. And with scoping, I think, and mapping, I think one important piece is also to engage the law firms and law firm partners really early on in the process, because if you don't do that, you're kind of missing a piece in the puzzle. And that's also something that we have seen as something that came out as a really strong practice across the different projects as well. And then maybe just two last things. Another thing that has also come up as something that seems to be of quite importance to making sure projects are successful, and Marianne has also talked about this as well, is just being very clear about roles and responsibilities really at the beginning, and really having that conversation at the start of the project. We have also seen some projects around the world that have even written down some of those role and responsibilities, whether that would be like an MOU or so, or some other kind of written agreement. And I think those type of written documentation, I think is perhaps also helpful. And I think, Marianne, you might also have some examples about this as well. And the last thing I will just add, in terms of like getting projects off the ground, and this is something that has also been really emerging in our work as well, is that considering how you can involve refugee communities in the design and then also in the implementation of projects to actually make sure that the projects themselves actually meet the needs of refugees is also really, really crucial. And some of the developments that we have seen have really taught us that when refugees are involved in the beginning, at the outset of the project, really in the design stage, and when they even get a chance perhaps to co-design and have some real input, then these projects end up usually being more effective in the long term. And in the long term will also ensure a better outcome for everyone. So if you're a law firm, then you can also consider to discuss with your NGO partners how they're doing this already, right? And how they are perhaps incorporating meaningful participation of refugees in their work already. And I think maybe this is also something that we can come back to later in the discussion round as well, because I think this is really like an emerging area of importance where there are some perhaps interesting models and good practices to talk about. And I think I'll maybe end there in the interest of time for the first question.
Perfect. Thanks, Julia.
Thanks,
Thanks for
Caroline.
kind of providing a helpful summary and sort of confirming, in addition to Marianne's experiences, you've also seen in other organizations. Okay, I'll be sure to speak slower for sure. But there are some sort of common themes, particularly with respect to initial scoping and laying the groundwork that are really important, including setting out clearly defined roles and responsibilities for all sides, both NGO sides and law firm partners alike. And to that point about considering involvement of refugee communities, I think that is definitely an important element as well. And it's something at Justice Center we're also trying to do. So to give a concrete example of a much smaller project we tried to do, we were looking to develop some legal information videos that were going to be shared with the refugee community in Hong Kong on what we initially thought would be on topics that we think are important as lawyers, like what is judicial review, how to get to the high court. And then we realized that we hadn't actually sort of consulted the refugee community about what videos, what information they actually would think were important. And so upon doing that consultation, actually, we realized that while those types of like legal topics were obviously interesting and important, there were other issues that we weren't aware of as an NGO that might have been equally important, like things about accessing healthcare or health services and things like that, that we have knowledge about, that we could provide information on, and that through the consultations with our clients realized, okay, maybe we can readjust our pro bono project and make the content about this instead. So that's sort of one way in which we try to incorporate the needs and respond to the needs of our clients. So, so thanks for sharing that. So maybe in the interest of time, we'll turn it over to round two, which I think will be very helpful for all of us here today. And round two question is more about sort of best practices and key elements in developing pro bono projects. So this is a little different to round one, which is I think is a bit more about laying the groundwork, but round two is more about after laying the groundwork. And once you're implementing the project, how do you implement the project in a way that will be successful successful and sustainable. So the first question is kind of, again, the key components of making a pro bono collaboration successful and sustainable, and some of the key lessons learned that should be taken away when considering how to build and sustain pro bono partnerships. And maybe to mix things up, we can maybe start with Julia first and maybe work backwards the way we did before.
Yeah, thanks, Caroline. I will share some overall finding and perspectives, that we have seen across the work. And then I think Marianne and Hanwi, they have some more specific examples of how they do some of those things and what has emerged for them. I think in terms of sustainability, there is actually really like two key things here, particularly with the projects that are more like on a long-term basis. And actually, I would really encourage everyone to look at how one can build long-term partnerships instead of, ad hoc collaboration that is not really sustainable in the first place. But with regards to making sure projects are sustainable, I think there's really two things that kind of have come up that are really quite key and instrumental. One is proper staffing, and the second one, which is somewhat connected, is funding. So on staffing, the most successful models that we have seen are really like properly staffed to do this work. So meaning that they would actually on the NGO side have like a full-time, pro bono coordinator or whatever you would want to call it, that basically deals with communicating with the law firm partners, that looks perhaps at suitable cases and so on, or pieces of work that can be referred to pro bono lawyers. Staff would usually also look at providing training also where needed, providing some supervision support and so on some of the cases. So I think it's needless to say that it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of time to make those partnerships really work. And as I just told you, it's really like a commitment on the NGO side to have somebody do this, right? And it cannot be done for free. So the funding needs to come from somewhere. And again, the most sustainable projects that we have seen are the ones that actually also have funding for some of those staffing positions, so that people can essentially be hired to do this type of work, that training can be organized, and some of those other things can also be done. I think there's different models of funding out there. In some cases, we have seen NGOs fundraise by themselves, right? Whether that would be like from family foundations, from the public and so on, or like a combination. Many of the law firms are also willing to provide funding. And I think maybe Caroline, Justice Center also has an interesting model of how you guys work with law firms, which you maybe want to talk about or not. But just to say that a lot of NGOs actually receive funding from law firms to actually do the work, which is a really great model. And personally, I would really encourage more law firms to fund some of this work. Somehow there sometimes seems to be a bit of a misbelief or so that, NGOs can do all of this for free and that there is no work behind the scenes, but actually it does take a lot of work and it just needs to be properly resourced from somewhere. And we have also seen some interesting models where law firms actually came together and made different contributions. So everyone making a contribution. So like collaborative type of models, which I think Marianne, you can also maybe say a few words about this as well. So overall, just to highlight again, funding and staffing are just really 2 points that are really, really important to the overall sustainability of the projects. And then maybe 2 other things that we have also seen really throughout all the projects that we have mapped in terms of key components, what makes projects successful. So one is training. Actually, throughout everything that we have met, I think training was always a key component, right? So because most of the time, when some of these projects are being kicked off, law firms that are involved might not have the expertise they need yet. In some cases, where it might be private law firms and so on, they might have, of course, useful skills and area and knowledge in existing areas. but not on refugee law. So very often the NGOs actually facilitate some kind of introductory training on refugee law, for example, whether it would be the international framework, local laws, and so on. Training can also cover aspects like ethics, for example, how to work with interpreters, self-care. So all these type of projects, all these type of aspects are things that we have seen to be covered as part of projects. And I think that's really like an important one. Because it also makes sure that lawyers have the right type of background and understanding, with many of them actually not being refugee lawyers and sometimes just not really having the awareness, being new to this type of work as well. And then actually we also see that, over time, even though on the NGO side in the beginning, there's a lot of investment that need to be made in terms of providing training and supervising cases and so on. Over time, the lawyers will also become more experienced and will have more knowledge and will also become more confident as well. So over time, the heavy investment that was needed in the beginning is actually not needed anymore at the end. And that is also what makes some of those projects really like successful and sustainable. So you also really need to be patient with it. I think it's not like a short-term endeavor to build up some of these projects, like a 1 or 2 year thing. I think it's really like a long time investment. And from the work that we have done in Thailand, for example, actually we're only in the 2nd year, but nowhere where we need to be yet. So I think it's just really also like an example for you that some of those things just take a really long time. And this is also what came out very clearly in the good practice mapping exercise as well. Sorry, Caroline, I'm done.
Perfect. Thanks, Julia. Maybe just to keep the conversation going,
Yes.
I'll hand it right over to Marianne to talk a little bit more perhaps about, the staffing matter. I know, Marianne, you mentioned you have expert lawyers on staff and sort of how that interacts with the training and sort of the necessity for funding. So I'll leave it to Marianne to take it forward.
Thanks, Caroline. And I would just echo everything that Julia just said. When I thought about this question of what our best practices, what do we know works through all of the work that we do, it was exactly those things that Julia talked about. So maybe I can just share a little bit of detail about how it works for us. Yes, we do I think probably the most important component for us when we are putting a project together is making sure that there is dedicated staff time for this, because if you're trying to set up a project of this kind and it's kind of like just adding it to a staff member's plate who already has a lot of other things to work on, to be honest, it's going to be really, really challenging. And when you have someone that is available, particularly at the outset, to do that kind of training, to do the supervision that is needed of the lawyers, it's really critical, and it makes a huge difference than to someone trying to manage this alongside a full load of other work on a daily basis. So if we've recognized that and we've built that in as a core component of every project that we set up, there needs to be either one dedicated staff member, or it's a couple of staff members, and we kind of ring fence a portion of their time. And it's not only important, I think, just in terms of managing the project, but it's also important in building up the confidence of the pro bono lawyers that we work with, because the reality is this kind of work has a huge impact on people's lives. You've got like research projects and other things that, if lawyers don't feel confident, they're still willing to give it a go, because it's research. There's not the same kind of impact as seeing a vulnerable client and getting it wrong. And that's a real fear that they have. And to be honest, I think that it's entirely justified. And so when they know that they have, a dedicated person that they can go to, where they're going to get quality training, where someone, at least for the first case or two cases, someone to hold their hand and answer any questions that they have, just available at the other end of the phone, it gives them the confidence to be able to do this work. Because every time we set up a new project, we get a similar reaction from lawyers that haven't done this work before. They're interested, they really want to make a difference. It sounds great, but I don't do this work, this is not within my comfort zone, and I don't know if I can do it. So them knowing that there is kind of a robust system of support that they can access enables them then to take that first step to try out a case. And then once they've done one or two, typically they may need much, much less support, and then they become a resource for other lawyers in the firm. But again, it's about kind of front loading that support and making sure that it's built in, which, and I mean, that of course leads directly into that question that Julia talked about in terms of resourcing and money, because to have an entire staff member is pretty expensive. And, Julia made the point that, law firms are increasingly also, providing financial support on these kinds of projects. And that's true in our experience. I think almost all of the law firms and companies that we work with do also financially contribute to KIND in one way or another. There's so many different ways of doing that, whether it's something, I think other organizations may do it on a, depending on the number of cases that you get. We don't do that. It's more of a kind of a voluntary, make a donation of whatever is possible for you. But it's an expression of their commitment to this work and recognition that us delivering cases to them is not free. All of this work that goes into the setup of it, all of the work that goes into screening cases, in designing and delivering training, of coming up with training manuals, as we do, it's a huge amount of work. If I think about, we just started a project in Italy this year, and there's expert lawyers on staff in the organization that we work with. So they're already doing some of this casework, and the idea of involving pro bono lawyers is that we're going to be able to scale up what they do. They can pass on the pieces of work that are more straightforward to the pro bono lawyers, enabling the experts to focus on more complex work. But it's taken us, and I see Julia from Pelnet, but she also works with us, is here, and has been really instrumental in helping us get this off the ground. But it's taken until September for us to do the first training for pro bono lawyers, because there's just been so much work that's gone into the setup of this. So increasingly law firms themselves are recognizing that alongside the donation of their lawyers' time, there should also be a financial contribution. In saying that, I recognize that every country, every firm has a different approach to this. And so with some firms, it's helpful for them to gain a little bit of experience with your organization, with the work, maybe before they may be willing to consider financially contributing to it. I've also heard someone from a law firm once said to me, if you want advice, ask for money. If you want money, ask for advice. So there's many different ways of approaching it. But I think thinking about that at the outset, and expecting, even if it's not at the very beginning, but that law firms at some point will or should start to contribute to the financial management of the project, is really important. And I think the only other thing that I would add is then also about relationships as being really, really important. The relationships that you have as the person at the NGO with, whether it's a pro bono manager or lawyers at the firms, it can really, to be honest, make or break a project. It's the difference between them feeling comfortable to come and say, you know what, this isn't going so well. I'm not really sure what I'm doing. You know, can you help me? And maybe not saying anything at all. Maybe not doing a great job on the case. So then you have a bad outcome from the client. The lawyer themselves, you know, feels like they've done something wrong, and then, you know, just says, okay, well, I'm not going to take another case. That was too stressful. So just building relationships so that you're able to have an open dialogue about what's happening and kind of check in with them. You know, offer more training if necessary. That part is really, really important. So, and then just the final piece, so the relationships, I think, is also connected to clarity, and Julia mentioned this earlier, to be as clear as possible at the outset about who does what and when, whose responsibility is it to, you know, follow up with a client after they submitted an application, who's going to pay for an interpreter if that's needed, who's going to pay for disbursements, what are you going to do in the event that the, you know, like lawyers can move between law firms, you know, on a regular enough basis. Like, what's going to happen like once, you know, a lawyer moves on somewhere else? So it's just starting to think about some of these things and putting it, whether it's in an MOU or kind of having it documented somewhere at the very beginning, can save a lot of time and a lot of stress later on. So I'll maybe stop there and hand back to Caroline.
Perfect. Thanks, Marianne. And if I can maybe just jump in very quickly on the kind of point about funding, I think it's also important to recognize as NGOs that do request funding is that you're not just asking for something for yourself. You are also providing something to the law firm that you're seeking to partner with. So there is value to the work that you do when it comes to scoping projects, delivering trainings. Those are things that you are providing to the law firm. So, you know, you don't necessarily always have to feel kind of shy or it's like a charity. You are delivering something as well, and that has value, and it's important to recognize that when thinking about how you're going to make your project sustainable. So in the interest of time, I'm going to hand it over to Huan He to also just to share from her experiences, key lessons learned and key components of successful sustainable projects. So thanks, Huan He.
Yep, I'm going to share my screen again. Just 1 second, please. Yep, here it is. So yeah, I thank you, Julia and Marianne, for sharing your experiences, because I fully agree and cannot more agree to you guys are saying that funding and resourcing are the key components, and also the dedicated steps are really important to actually just make this working at reality. Because so I think the reason that this kind of a collaboration between the network, law firm public interest network, and the Nansen is because we partially, it's not perfect yet, but we partially solve the problem of, you guys are saying, the funding, resourcing, and maybe the dedicated steps. We partially solve the problem that we. So, and we're going to talk about the challenges for the next session again, but for this session, I think the key components of this collaboration has been running well for years. I'm not actually sure, but maybe it's for about 5 years so far. So I think this collaboration was successful because of the synergy. In one word, I think it's a synergy, because a synergy between the legal professionals and the activities from civil society, because in this collaboration, we can make the most of each one's strength, so we can effectively protect refugees' rights. So I divided my slide into 2 parts to explain each one's expertise. So for law firms first, I think we can utilize the law firms, especially big firms, resources and expertise in refugee protection, because as you see already that there are big law firms as a member of this network. So we can also have, even if they are not like public interest lawyers who are focusing on only the pro bonos, and they are doing their work, which is just distributed by their law firm. But for spare time, they can also take part in this projects that we have with the MOU with Nansen. So so there are many, the big pool that we can utilize from the big firms. So there are many lawyers and they have their own other expertise. So we can also utilize that kind of know-how. So by representing an individual refugee applicants, they have a specialty in litigation, of course, and so it is possible to systemically support refugee cases also. So we have accumulated data and expertise, and especially for litigation, it's better for lawyers to collect and disclose evidences at the court and also the court pleading, because for many years, each law firms and the network itself has accumulated its know-how to deal with the refugee cases. And also for we can also have, as I just said, that there are lawyers from various specialties, such as criminal case, because, for example, it's a real case. There was a refugee applicant who wanted to be recognized as a refugee in Korea, but he got into a sort of trouble, and the criminal case started against him. But for refugee recognition, it is really difficult for him to be recognized as a refugee in Korea if they have a criminal record. So even if it's not actually the refugee case, but we also help him to get out of the criminal charges, and so we can help him maybe indirectly to get refugee status more easily in Korea. So, and for this is for the individual cases, and for when we also have like a strategic litigation, which we also call the planned litigation. It's usually for legal system improvements, and so it's like as I just wrote here, it's like addressing legal issues on government policy, so we can reform the policy and reform the system of the government to support the refugee and also other minorities. And also, we also have many cases of the constitutional litigations that we point out the unconstitutionality in the statutory law. And so for those strategic or planned litigation, it's very new issues. Every time it's new issues. So it's mainly it's something that's never tried in Korea before, and it's all the time is probably the first time for every issue. So it is really hard to be handled by a sole attorney or a single entity. For those cases, we can lawyers from different firms, we can collaborate to come up with the creative ways for problem solving, maybe. So I think that's like a key of the collaboration and cooperation. So I think that's another good point. And for Nansen, as I said, it's a refugee rights center, and they have a long history, established in 2009, probably one of the first organizations in civil society to help refugees. So they strive to recover the rights of refugees by improving social awareness and system responding to cases, and they also consult the refugee rights by like interviewing each refugee applicant. So I think they have a really good capacity to support refugees in by supporting like comprehensive and maybe in other words holistic supports. So mostly a refugee, as you guys all know, that a refugee applicant not only has issues for a visa or status permit, but they also have issues for their health problem, housing, and just working and things like education and things like that. So for Nansen, they have like we call it case management. So they give them a holistic, comprehensive support, not only for the legal issues but as just Marianne said, that it's just a new life here in Korea. So I think and there's also activist, but there's also a public interest lawyer in Nansen. So, and she is, I think that's, when Marianne said that the dedicated step, I just come up the public interest lawyer Nancy just came up to my mind, because I think she's super good in coordinating between the refugees and the networks. So she actually interviews and investigates and discover the cases. So while doing this kind of comprehensive case management, she looks at the case for each one, and then if she finds something that needs a legal assistance or legal support, they just refer to that kind of case to the law firm public interest network. So I think she, in between, she coordinates it really well, and she's a super good communicator. So I think that kind of dedicated staff, as Marian said, is a really key point that for us to have this successful collaboration so far. Yeah, I think that's pretty much of me. So I'm going to hand it to Carolyn again.
Perfect. Thanks, Wonhee. And I think that's a great point, is to really utilize law firms' know-how and their expertise. To give a quick example from Justice Center, we're working on an unlawful detention case where the client is seeking civil damages for an injury, like personal injury caused by detention. And so Justice Center, we're the experts on unlawful detention, but we're not experts on mediation and negotiation. And so that's kind of where the law firm has really been able to add their value. So I'm going to take a quick pause here just to see if there are any questions or comments or thoughts from our audience about the two rounds of questions that we've talked about. So initial first steps or best practices and key takeaways for pro bono projects. So does anyone want to share any thoughts or questions based on what our speakers have sort of shared so far? If not, I can always move on to the third topic about challenges and overcoming challenges, but I'll give maybe 10 seconds, anyone? Don't be shy. Or if you are shy, you can also share your question in the chat box as well.
Hi, Caroline. Can I ask a quick question?
Of course, John.
If nobody else has one.
Yeah,
I'm just curious to get people's thoughts, and I thought maybe Marianne would be a good one to comment here, but I'm also curious about Wonhee's thoughts. But a situation where the feedback you get from the organization, the NGO that's being assisted, or maybe the individual, him or herself, is less than positive about the law firm working on the case. And I'm just wondering, how has your organization dealt with that? Are there any tips that you can give for other organizations that really we love working with law firms, they support us, we want to, their time is very valuable, but the feedback isn't great and we don't want to lose them, we don't want to discourage them. It might be their first time doing this. So I'd love to get some further insight on that. Thanks.
Well, I'm happy to hop in and respond, and perhaps Wonhee will also have thoughts on this. And the first thing that I'll say is actually that tends to be one of the first concerns, like as people are developing these kinds of projects, that does tend to be one of the first concerns that they have. But in our experience, those cases, it's such a small number. So we haven't had to develop, like a really robust response to situations like that, because it happens so rarely. Because quite honestly, you're working with people that are pretty well trained, and I think one of the ways that could kind of preempt challenges like that is by having conversations at the outset about what the management structure will be like in the law firm. So, it's not just, for example, a trainee lawyer that is taking on the case and there's no one else at the law firm that's kind of looking at what they're doing. Typically there'll be a partner involved in the kind of oversight that will sign off on the work. Ideally, there'll also be a pro bono manager at the firm, but I realize, that's not the case everywhere. But making sure that there's some internal mechanism of oversight, so that A, the work is being checked and there's someone that's, checking that things are delivered, and B, it means that there is someone to go to if issues like that do come up. And then, I think it's also why this relationship piece is so important, because it makes it much easier to go back to someone and just say, look, the work that you've done on this particular case hasn't been what we needed on this, and being able to just explore what went wrong. Was it a case that they just got overwhelmed? Did they need more training? Just really kind of getting to the root of what happened makes a difference, not just for that lawyer and their confidence in taking another case, but it also helps us to learn about perhaps, okay, well, we actually need to add another element to the training that we hadn't considered before. The other thing that I would say to preempt those kinds of challenges is to build check-ins into the work. So not just hand a case over to the firm and then, wait for them to come back and tell you what happened, but to build, like a certain milestones, maybe do it on a monthly basis, whatever it is, to check in and say, how's things going? What support might you need from us? Like I said, it really is, it hasn't been an issue that we've faced a lot of. And when we have, I don't know a time when it has like stopped that individual or that law firm from continuing to work with us. So yeah, those are my thoughts, but maybe Julia or Juan-He has other thoughts on that.
Yeah, just to add on, maybe because I can't not really give you the right answer, because as a attorney at law, and I don't belong to law firm, but I'm one of the legal professionals. So maybe the refugees who do not really have the positive feedback for our litigation process or our legal support. Maybe they don't talk to me directly. Maybe they talk to the NGO. So I haven't got any that kind of not good or negative feedbacks yet. But it's a little bit different story. But there are times that they got upset about the verdicts, like the results from the court, because maybe you might know that it's less than 1%, less than 1% is the recognition rates from the government. And even if we gone through all this litigation process from the first court to the third, it doesn't really go up. So there are, even if we do many cases, usually, we fail, we lose. and it's a typical thing in refugee litigation. But anyways, so they might be upset about the results of the court, and their attitudes not really friendly to refugees, and they don't follow the international standards for refugee protection. So they might get upset about that. But as Marianne just said for the previous presentation, I think it's really important to have a personal relationship with my clients, and because when we have a relationship personally, they understand the situation, and they really they show us gratitude. And then I think it was good. I have a memory that one refugee applicants from Sudan, he just said we are having a litigation together right now, but he said that was probably the first person in Korea who listened to his voice. So I think that kind of memory just keep me going. But anyways, I think that kind of relationship is really important to have this thing going on. So yeah.
Thank you very much.
And thanks, John, for that question. I think it actually kind of leads nicely into our last topic, which is kind of about challenges that we might encounter when navigating these pro bono partnerships and programs. So maybe I'll just kind of open it up to all the speakers and anyone else in the audience who might also want to contribute in terms of challenges that you might have come across in sustaining or navigating your pro bono programs with law firm partners or with NGOs and things like that. So I don't know if anyone wants to go first, either Juan-He or Marianne, Julia. Feel free to jump in to share any particular challenges, and I guess more importantly, how did you overcome those challenges or address them?
Yeah, I'm gonna just go first because I have is that okay, Marianne? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So for challenges and Yeah, as I just said that the fact that there is less than 1% of refugee recognition compared to the people who apply for refugee status. So we still, even if we do have the kind of collaboration and people who focus on and dedicated to the refugee protection, we still have a really in a position that are lacking the resources, because there are so many cases that we cannot handle. So I don't want to really say lucky to these people, but yeah, it's a situation that if the refugee applicant can get legal aid from the legal professionals, I think it's lucky for them, because there are really a limited number of refugees can get this kind of legal aid, because it's a really small organization, and I think there are maybe 200 lawyers mainly focusing on the public interest law activities and pro bonos, but it's really a small number of lawyers compared to the whole number of law professionals in Korea. It's 26,000 in total. So I think it's less than 1%. Okay. So yeah, still, yeah, we need more lawyers, so we can have more legal support for people who are in need. And preference is that it means that when we have a meeting with Nansen for what kind of cases to carry on, there are, yeah, it's to be super honest with you guys, there are preferences, and the preference sometimes pretty much mostly it's the same, because people don't really want to take the difficult cases. There are difficult cases, and yeah, difficult cases are hardly to be taken by the legal professionals. So that's another challenging. And as I said, we need a comprehensive, holistic support for refugees, because they have not only legal issues, but there are other issues to have a sustainable, safe life here, a new life here in Korea. But yeah, this kind of case management needs more time and more labor to just care every aspect of life. So in that sense, we also have more resources, and we need more resources. But yeah, that's always challenges. And and personally, I always feel very sorry to just turn down that since because of the limited resources in our organization, and for me personally too, turn down the cases that when I said that I can't represent you for your case, I feel really sorry. And then yeah, it's lacking resources is always the first problem, I think, in Korea. Yeah, and so we'd like to solve this problem and overcome these challenges in many ways, but it's not easy, because this kind of problem mostly based on the structural issues, so it's not really, yeah, tackle the problem in a short period of time. So, but positive aspect is that law firm pro bono activities are expecting. Actually, it is increasing, and it is expected to increase because it says that scrutiny from civil society is also expanded, and there is a peer pressure within major law firms too. Actually, yeah, last month there was a article about like how many hours the big firm, how many hours a lawyer from big firm spent on the pro bono cases. So in this kind of a competition between like who cares the pro bono cases more seriously between the big firms, the kind of pressure we also expect to increase their inputs and more funding to this pro bono acts, yeah, hopefully. And there's also in Korea, there's also a mandatory pro bono report for every lawyer. I think it's 20 hours a year, maybe. I'm not actually sure, but the kind of a mandatory pro bono requirements is also, I think, the added incentive in Korea. But as I said, it's difficult to overcome these challenges really in a creative way. So if you have any good ideas, I'd like to listen to it. If you have any ideas too. So yeah.
Thanks, Won-hee. I don't know if Marianne or Julia also want to share challenges that you've identified through your own programs or through the mapping.
I'm happy to just hop on something that Won-hee said, which is about this issue of managing the the need for assistance and the number of lawyers available. And just to say, we have different experience on that across the different pieces of work that we do. But it's interesting, for example, where we have kind of been very specific about the type of work that's going to be done through the project, that kind of helps a little bit with managing the flow of cases and the number of lawyers. So I think, for example, we have our work in Ireland. We deal specifically with family reunification applications and applications for citizenship. The number of cases of unaccompanied children in Ireland is relatively low compared to most other places. So that also kind of necessarily limits the amount of cases that are going to come. But just by being very specific about what it is that we work on, it kind of helps to control the flow that's coming to us. Doesn't mean that there isn't a whole host of other legal needs faced by the refugee community in Ireland, but it's about recognizing what we can do. And so that's been really effective. And, and in fact, what we've seen with the casework in Ireland is that there's actually more demand from the pro bono lawyers than we have cases at times, and it fluctuates. And that's the other thing, is that it's incredibly difficult to get this balance between the number of cases that you have and the number of lawyers that you have available. And, we try really hard not to train too many lawyers and have not enough cases, because if they go through a training in January and they don't get a case until the following December, I mean, they're going to need to be retrained because they'll have forgotten everything that they learned. So when we do training, we try to limit it to the kind of predicted number of cases we think we might have or have the capacity to handle. If we know that the staff member that we have is really only going to be able to get, source and screen and refer, 100 cases, we try to kind of connect that to the number of lawyers that we train. But I agree, it's an ongoing challenge to find that balance. And then also, my oh, it's okay. My daughter's here. It's okay, love. It's okay. Yes. So the other issue is about resourcing and funding. You can say hi. And one of the things that we've done has been really helpful in helping us to secure funds for the work is tracking what we do, evaluating it, gathering data. It doesn't have to be elaborate. We have a spreadsheet, where we gather, okay, like the number of cases, the demographics, what the outcomes are, the number of pro bono lawyers that have worked, the number of hours also that we have to spend in training and supervision, so that we have that data when we go to seek funding for the work, when we go to the firms, to say, look, this is what it is that you're supporting, so that there's something concrete there. And then let me just see, the only other things in terms of challenges that I'll mention is about work culture. Sometimes there's a difference between how we work within NGOs and perhaps the pace of work and the approach to work within law firms. For example, when you respond to emails, and that's, yes, I know. So let me see, there's one other Actually, my only other issue was about underperformance and it not really being an issue. But John already raised that, so I don't need to talk about that. So I'm going to stop there because I have a friend. Yeah, maybe hand over to Julia if she has anything else on this.
I think you guys have covered actually a lot of things already. And then Jonathan also asked the question that I also wanted to raise as a challenge that has also been covered. So Caroline, you'd want to jump to questions because technically we're kind of
Yeah, I know
at the
we
ending
are.
time already, right?
We're
Let's
at the
see if
ending
there's some
time, but
questions.
I would encourage everyone who is here to please take this time to kind of, share your own thoughts or reflections if you are already engaged in refugee rights pro bono, or to ask any one of our panelists specific questions, or just a broader question to the whole group. If you do have questions, now's your chance. And so I'll just pause here and allow anyone to jump in from the audience. You can also share your question in the chat if you don't want to turn on your microphone. If there are no questions from the audience, I do have a question, and it's kind of something we talked about already, but I think it's an important one because of how important funding is to getting projects off the ground and running sustainably. And I guess the last question would just kind of be to all the panelists would be, what would you tell NGOs or RLOs that are interested in receiving financial support from law firms, but maybe have some hesitations about approaching law firms for that kind of support? What would you tell them about how to start and how to start those conversations, including possibly about funding?
I'm happy to kick off on this. I would say, first of all, remember that you're not asking this person for money. It's not coming out of their own pocket, and I think particularly as NGOs, we feel a reluctance, about talking about money, explicitly asking for it. It's uncomfortable, but this money isn't coming out of that person's pocket. It's coming out of the organizational pocket. And so I think that at least for me, that kind of helps me feel less stressed about those financial conversations. And also that they kind of, at least increasingly they expect it as well. They expect to pay for translation services. They expect to pay for other services. And so kind of framing it in that mindset of we are providing a service to them. So it's appropriate for us to ask for payment. It's not really payment, but for financial contribution. And then the other thing I would say is if you can provide information on what that money goes towards. So like kind of just a bit of a breakdown in terms of, okay, this is what it costs to run this project. We are paying for a staff member. We are paying for whether it's transport or office costs, or this is what this project costs us to run. So that in the context of a project that costs maybe, 60,000 euros, and we're only asking you to contribute 5,000, and if you each contribute 5,000, that kind of gets us, halfway, or kind of, we'll cover the cost of it, but being explicit about what their money is going towards and what the actual cost of running the project is. So those are the two things that I would suggest.
Great. And Julia, Juanhi, any additional thoughts?
No, I think from my side, very similar as what Marianne has said. I think because as NGOs, most of the time we're kind of shy to ask, right? So we kind of like, we feel like hesitant and shy to just basically bring it up. But honestly, the worst case, what can happen is that somebody says no, right? So you haven't really lost anything or embarrassed yourself. So I would really encourage NGOs to just make the ask in the first place. And the more specific you can be in terms of what the money would go to, I think the better. So being quite clear, in terms of what you're going to do with the funds and so on, I think is also really helpful and probably will increase your chances instead of kind of going there with maybe like a wide not quite clear ask.
Yeah, my point is not really about the funding, but it's rather making opportunities to work together for another collaboration. So maybe, yeah, as you two already said that, I think by active like networking and getting to know each other, I think you can uh, we can have like solidarity in certain areas. And I think by active networking and meeting people, I think you can also meet the people who shares the same interest or same commitment. Then there can be a collaboration from that point, and I think the positive changes can follow from that point. So I yeah, the circumstances may vary from country to country, but yeah, I also think that maybe you can contact law firms first, because yeah, they might also are looking for the opportunities to working with NGOs, and the CSR, as I already said many times, has become more important than ever, also for law firms too. And so most of all, to protect refugee and help them to find a new life is a shared agenda across the border. So I think that can be there should be an opportunity for to work together. And if we work together for certain issues, then maybe the funding can also follow.
Thanks all. And I think we also have a question in the chat from Jasmine from Pelnet. And just to quickly summarize, Jasmine's question is whether any of the speakers have experience in incorporating virtual work into our collaborative pro bono projects, maybe with even law firms in other countries, and any top tips as we kind of scope projects further in terms of remote engagement. And maybe just from Justice Center, I can quickly add and answer this question. So from Justice Center's side, we have definitely, because of the pandemic, had to kind of take a pause and think about how to keep engagement with our law firm partners. And because training is also a key element of our pro bono program, we knew that we had to find a way to deliver training in a way that would be accessible for our pro bono partners in Hong Kong, but also possibly abroad. So essentially what we did was we incorporated half of our training and migrated it online to become an online training through pre-recorded videos and some quizzes and reading materials. And by migrating our training partially online, it actually expanded the scope of the access of our training beyond just the law firm partners that we have in Hong Kong. So a lot of these international law firms that have offices in the UK, around Europe, other parts of Asia, they were now able to access Justice Center's training. And by being able to access our training, they also became potential partners who could also engage in our work outside of the Hong Kong offices. So one way that we incorporated virtual work, or just to incorporate sort of digital solutions, was to make our trainings more accessible by making them go online. So that's my answer to that question, but I'll leave it to the panelists also to share if you have any experiences with remote work.
We do. I mean, of course, when the pandemic hit, it was a necessity. Our work in Europe had actually just started, so we were getting prepared to do all this work in person, and we had to very quickly pivot. And it looked quite different. So we work with illegal European lawyers in Lesvos on delivering legal assistance in Greece, and the pro bono lawyers that they work with come from all across Europe. And so we had to look at how to adapt to be able to still engage those lawyers remotely. Versus in Ireland, we were looking at engaging local lawyers, but the issues were the same. We had to look at, okay, how do you sign documents online? Just some of the kind of practical issues like that. How do you ensure privacy when you are having client meetings? Making sure that there's, a stable internet connection, particularly for the client. There's a whole host of logistical issues. And I have to say the law firms really took the lead on that aspect. They had more resources than us. They had tech teams that were able to kind of figure out the answer. So we really leaned on them to help us figure out that piece. And I'll just echo what Caroline said in terms of when you start to do things online, trainings and things. I mean, yes, you lose something from not being in person, but actually it does also for us expand the pool of lawyers who may be able to attend either live or, because you can easily record the trainings at a later point. It saves you as the NGO having to kind of repeat that training for every new cohort of lawyers that joins. I'm trying to think if we have can't think of other specific tips, but just to say, if you're thinking about it, I certainly know a couple of people that we are working with, internally, and we also have our own tech team, and then some of our partners that have made that switch. So certainly, if you're interested to know more and have more questions, you can just give me a shout.
Any other final comments for our panelists? If not, I might, in the interest of time, I know we've gone over, so thank you to everyone who stayed behind for the rest of this session. But just to wrap up, this really has been a very informative conversation, I think. And I wish we could keep going, but in the interest of time, I am going to wrap up. So thank you to all of our speakers for providing such in-depth insight into how pro bono projects can really work and how we can address some of the challenges that may arise throughout the course of engaging with pro bono partners. I also want to thank our audience here today for tuning into this really important exchange of information around best practices in refugee rights pro bono work. Just by being here today and attending and this knowledge sharing, it kind of reflects a key takeaway from today's discussion, which is that increasing access to legal assistance and justice for refugees really is a whole of society approach. And it's great to see so many different legal and civil society actors engaged in this topic today. So we hope today's discussion, you'll take away some of the information and tools that were shared to either begin scoping new projects that you might want to undertake or enhance the sustainability and impact of projects that are already underway. For those of you who would like more resources on building successful pro bono projects, I think Julie is going to helpfully share an Ngo Pro Bono Toolkit in the chat. This was developed by members of the core group of the GRF Pledge and is a really useful document outlining some top tips that we've kind of talked about today. If you are a CSO or NGO in need of pro bono assistance to address the unmet legal needs of refugees or asylum seekers, you might also want to refer to the GRF Legal Community Pledge matching portal with a related guide that I think Julia can also share in the chat now. So with that being said, thank you everyone again for joining us and have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you all.
Thank you all our panelists. Please wait for the magic word.
Oh, okay.
Our secretariat will put it up in a second.
Oh, perfect.
That's a legal service provider, which is related to our session today.
We can leave, right? Secretariat, correct?
Yes, you can leave.
Okay.
Sorry.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Everyone.
Just checking.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks, bye.